Good morning, all. Welcome to the 5th RLMS Users Conference. My name is Vladimir Gimpelson. I'm Director of the Center for Labor Market Studies at the Higher School of Economics and Professor and Economics Faculty of Department of Economics at the HSE, and also I'm an active RLMS user. RLMS, as survey becomes more and more popular, so we have the 5th conference, and more people across around the globe use the data, and it's very good news for RLMS. Today we have a session on consumption. We have 2 presenters, 1 hour for both, and it means that please keep your presentation within 20 minutes in order to spare some time for questions and discussions. Okay, after this short words, I would like to give floor to Darya Kolesnik, who will present the paper Impact of Credit Supply Shocks on Heterogeneous Household Consumption. So Darya, the floor is yours. Go on.
Hello, everyone. My name is Darya Kolesnik, and today I'm going to present the paper joined with Pestova about the impact of credit supply shocks on consumption of heterogeneous households in Russia. And unfortunately, Anna cannot join us today, so I will present by my own. And again, I would like to thank organizers for the possibility to present here. So let me start. First of all, I would like to note that during the last 10-15 years in Russia, we can observe a growing importance of financial and banking sector. But at the same time, in the literature, the main focus is usually aimed at monetary policy shocks and its effect on consumption and investment, while credit supply shocks are not that well studied. And we believe that credit supply shocks has their own value, own importance beyond the effect of monetary policy and other shocks. And in our paper, we study how consumers change their behavior in response to credit supply shocks, and also explore whether their responses are heterogeneous. And to begin with, let me introduce you to our shocks. And our shocks reflect changes in credit availability, changes in bank capital, bank funding, risk perceptions, and other factors. And we use a structural vector of the regression framework as a baseline paper of Gambetti-Musso and Mudmas et al. And we use sign restrictions and narrative sign restrictions based on Russian microdata to identify our credit supply shocks. In the sign restrictions, we use the following 5 parameters: output, inflation, loan volume, risk-free rate, and lending rate, in order to identify credit supply shock and also monetary policy and aggregate supply shock. And here in the table, you can see signs of our sign restrictions, and I believe they are quite intuitive. And we also incorporate to our methodology narrative sign restrictions using the facts about what happened in Russian economy in 2014. In particular, we use the following 3 episodes: monetary policy tightening in the last quarter of this year, and also Crimea-related and East Ukraine-related sanctions in the 2nd and the 3rd quarter of 2014, which allow us to improve estimations of our credit supply shocks. And as a result, we received time series of credit shocks, which I want to illustrate here. The back line is our credit supply shocks. And on the first figure, I compare them with bank lending conditions indicators provided by the Bank of Russia. And here you can see that the dynamics is similar, because bank lending conditions can be considered as an alternative measure of credit supply shocks, but they have a shorter time span, because the general indicator starts only in 2009, and the more specific ones about mortgage and consumption starts only in 2011, while our time series are longer. And also, even though they have similar dynamics, they are not identical, meaning that our credit supply shocks capture more factors affecting the economy. And on the second figure, I compare our shocks with the dynamics of consumption growth calculated based on RLMS data. And again, you can see that they move more or less in a similar way. meaning that we can already assume that credit supply shocks can have predictive power for consumption. Now let me move to the household data we use. We use the data provided by RLMS starting from 2006, because in this year they introduced questions about debts. And in our sample, we have households with working members from 20 to 60, and we use data on consumption, on the number of demographic characteristics, and what is important, we use heterogeneity parameters such as tenure and relation to credit. We use tenure for two reasons. First of all, we would like to control for wealth, but it is not feasible. And the common measure for wealth, such as income, is not good for us because it is a bad control. It is connected, related with credit supply shocks. So we decided to use tenure as a proxy for wealth. And another reason is that usually in the literature about monetary policy shocks, in the recent literature, authors consider tenure categories as a proxy for income groups, such as wealthy, hand-to-mouth, and so-called wealthy hand-to-mouth, which are people with mortgage, because people with mortgage have high income, because otherwise they won't be able to get mortgage. But at the same time, they spend a large share of their income on repaying their debts. That's why they don't have much money for consumption, and in that sense, they are hand-to-mouth. However, this concept is based on American data, and I will show you whether it can be applied to Russia. And besides, we use relation to credit as another heterogeneity parameter, and it is a simpler categorization. We split population in 4 groups with no credit, with mortgage, consumer credit, and car loans. And these groups are mutually exclusive, meaning that if household has 2 types of credit, this is not considered at all in our baseline estimations. And I also would like to show you another 2 figures where you can see distribution of consumption across different groups. And in the first one, I compare groups categorized by tenure. And it's important to note, the first thing important to note here is that people with mortgage have the highest consumption compared to other groups, meaning that the concept of wealthy hand-to-mouth is not held for Russia, and that Russian population simply seems to be different in that sense from American population. And also, I would like to note here that people who own their dwellings, their apartment without mortgage, they have the lowest consumption on average. And also, according to summary statistics, they have lowest income and the highest age. I suppose that this group of people are just older people who have low income, low wages, and that's why they consume the least. And on the second figure, you can see comparison of groups split by relation to credit. And again, here we can see that people with mortgage and another large debt, such as car loan, consume the most, while people with no credit consume the least, meaning that people who have no credit, they probably either have low income, so they just do not have access to that, or they just decide not to take credit, and that's why they cannot use that to boost their consumption. And on the both graph, I would like to say for both of them that people with large debts, mortgage or car loan, they consume the most, meaning that they have more space for adjusting their consumptions in response to shock. So we can expect that these groups will respond more to shocks. And now let's move to our methodology. We use 2 alternative approaches. The first one implies interactions. The formula looks big, but actually it's quite easy to understand. Our dependent variable is logarithm of consumption. We control for credit supply shocks and for monetary policy or aggregate supply shocks, just to be sure that credit supply shocks has their own value. We also control for type. It is a dummy variable for our heterogeneity groups, for the list of demographic variables in X. And most importantly, we control for the interaction of credit supply shock and our type dummy variable. And our coefficient of interest is this delta 2jk. And we will see if interaction with one particular group will have more high coefficient than the other. We also control for interactions with other shocks for lack of dependent variable because it have high predictive power and also because it is often considered in literature, and for time control and household fixed effect. Alternatively, we use another approach, maybe a more simple approach, when we just split our sample in subsamples according to types and run these regressions, and then compare alpha k coefficient between different regressions to see which group respond to credit supply shocks more. And now let me jump to results. The first table reflects just the general effect without heterogeneity. And here the main takeaway is that credit supply shock has positive and significant coefficient in predicting the consumption, even in the presence of other shocks and the presence of such high predictive coefficient as such predictive control as lack of dependent variable, we still see that credit supply shock has significant effect. And besides, we controlled for not only for the zero lag, but also first and second lag in the baseline estimations to check for some postponed effects or cyclicality. And here we found out that in the second leg, we have negative coefficient, meaning that if you 2 years ago had positive credit supply shock, 2 years after you will reduce your consumption because first 2 years ago you maybe took credit and you increased your consumption, but 2 years later you have already spent your money, but you still have debt to repay, and that's why you will reduce your consumption 2 years later. But now let's move to the more interesting results about heterogeneity. Here you can see the table about interactions and heterogeneity by tenure. The most important line here is the first one, where we see interaction of mortgage group with credit supply shocks, and the coefficient is positive and significant independently on specification, meaning that people with mortgage respond more to credit supply shocks compared to the baseline group who are owners without mortgage. These coefficients can be explained by two different channels. First one is that if we have positive credit supply shock, it means that people with mortgage can somehow refinance their debts or find another way to improve their financial state. And that's why they will respond more to credit supply shocks. And the other channel is indirect, meaning that credit supply shocks not only affect household directly, but also they affect firms. And for example, in case of negative shock, they will affect firm negatively, and firms will reduce costs, reduce wages, and people will have lower income. And in that case, as far as people with mortgage have higher consumption on average, as I showed you before, they have more space to adjust their consumption. They will reduce the consumption more and respond to shocks more compared to other groups. And now let me move to the last table, where we use another approach and split sample into subsamples according to groups with heterogeneity by relation to credit. And the first thing to note here is that only people with mortgage and car loan have significant response to credit supply shocks, while other groups with no credit and small consumer credit do not respond to shocks at a significant level. And that's interesting to note because it means that the general effect I showed you before is mostly driven by these two groups, even though they are not so well populated. And now let me, I suppose I don't have much time left, so now let me go through our robustness checks quickly. I just want to mention that we used Ailerana bond estimations because we control for lack of dependent variable and it would have created homogeneity concerns. So we check that it does not. And we also considered bank lending conditions, which I mentioned at the beginning. We used them instead of credit supply shocks, just to be sure that our conclusions do make sense. And we received results weaker compared to ours, but still similar in sense of science. So we can conclude that our outcomes are more or less correct. And now let me jump to conclusions. The main takeaway from our paper is that credit supply shocks have their own value beyond effects of monetary policy or aggregate supply shocks. And also, as far as concerns heterogeneity, we found that people with mortgage respond more to credit supply shocks than people without mortgage who own their apartments. And also that people with large debts, such as mortgage or car loans, respond more to credit supply shocks compared to other groups. That's it. Thank you for your attention. And I'm ready to answer your questions.
Darya, thank you very much. Special thanks for being in time. Any questions? Okay, I have a few questions.
Okay.
Can you explain more on how you identify credit supply shocks on individual level? And the related question is, when we speak about mortgage or credits, we mean individuals, yes? when we talk about consumption, this is household level. And credit supply shocks, is it aggregate for the country, for the whole economy, or how you define it and how you estimate it using RLMS data? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, sure. Sorry that I wasn't clear about that. As concerns credit supply shocks, they are macro shocks, so they are not based on RLMS data. They are based on our estimations with our sign restrictions and narrative sign restrictions based on macro Russian data. So these shocks are just common for all households. And as concerns mortgage and other debts, we considered households as a one unit. And if at least one person in the household has mortgage, we consider this household as a household with mortgage. So we incorporate individual and household level in that sense.
Okay, thank you. But it would be good, of course, to have better discussion about it in the presentation.
Okay.
It's not clear from that. Questions? No questions. Darya, then let me thank you once again for your presentation, very interesting, and I want to wish you success in publishing this as a paper, and I hope it has some good prospects for publication. And we can move to the second presentation. This is Silas Amo-Agyei. And yeah, Silas, are you here?
Yes, I am. Do you see my screen?
Yes. Yes.
Just 1 second. Okay. So welcome everyone to my section. In this section, I use the RLMS data set to study the effect of health on the marginal utility of consumption. And here I use real consumption estimates directly extracted from the data set. And it is important to mention that this work is still in progress, so your feedback during and after the presentation will be much appreciated. All right, so as a motivation, this question about how utility function of the individual varies with health status is very important in applied economics. And in theory, you can imagine that poor health status may increase or decrease the extent to which an individual enjoys consumption. For example, an individual may enjoy consumption more when she is in a sick state or when she is in a healthy state. But without data, you cannot really tell. And normally in the literature, they make assumptions about the sign and the direction of this dependence of utility on health. And this question is very important because it has implications for optimal economic decisions, such as life cycle savings, long-term care, disability insurance, or optimal transfer policies. And transfer policies is very important in the current COVID situation as to whether to transfer more to people who are sick in order to maximize their well-being or not. But aside this, in the literature, normally this dependence of utility on health is sort of assumed away in determining optimal insurance plans or long-term care. But then this is not the first time this question has been, or someone has attempted to answer this question. Limited literature have tried it, but in most cases they use income as a proxy for consumption, and they mainly focus on high income countries. But in the literature, we realize that consumption tends to be more closely linked with well-being than income. So it's very important to answer this question using directly measures of consumption rather than income. So this is the main contribution of this paper. So before that, there are two approaches of trying to answer this question. One is about revealed demand approach, as in how basing how individuals reveal their preferences for moving resources across 2 states, healthy state and sick state. And then you can assume, you can follow how people make these transfers and estimate this dependence. And for example, using insurance market, or using risky assets, for example. But then it's very difficult to use that approach because you have to make strong assumptions about utility and consumption. And depending on the utility function you make, your estimate might vary. But what I do is I use the second approach, which is about observed utility, measuring how individuals' utility change associated with their health status varies across individuals of different consumption levels, which I'm going to show more when I move on. And in addition to that, I also studied this question in a non-high income country setting, and I'm able to use both objective and subjective health measures to test this dependence. So before I go on, I just want to briefly illustrate the approach I use and how it works in general. So here I have 2 figures. On the left-hand side, you can imagine that this is how utility moves with consumption in good health state. And then this is how utility moves with consumption in poor health state. And depending on how the slopes change across different levels of consumption will tell whether the sign is positive or negative in terms of whether health state improves marginal utility of consumption or not. So here you can see that the curve in the poor state is flatter than the healthy state, meaning that marginal utility moves slower in poor health state than in good health state. And this means that health state reduces marginal utility of consumption. But then here on the reverse, you see that the utility increases faster in poor health state, meaning that if you are sick, you tend to enjoy more from your consumption than when you are in a good health state. So this is just to conceptualize how it works. But then the net effect of the average sign depends on the relative importance of these two. So here you can think of as consumption as complements to good health. For example, if you think of leisure activities like skiing or traveling, you want to be healthy to enjoy doing that. And here you can think of this as substitute goods to health, like having assistance to self-care or calling in someone to come and cook for you. In that sense, you enjoy it more when you are sick. So the net effect is how these two opposing mechanisms, which one is heavier when you weigh the two. So in a nutshell, this is what I find. I reject the now that health state, or I reject the now that the utility function does not depend on individuals' health status, and that is normally how it's been assumed. So contrary to what is normally assumed, I find that the utility function depends heavily on the individual's health status. And the direction is kind of negative in the sense that marginal utility of consumption increases as health deteriorates. And if you think about it, it might sound a bit counterintuitive, but then it makes... Any question?
Если какие-то вопросы? Если какие-то вопросы?
Andrei, you're in English channel.
Я на английском. Странно, у меня не переключается канал. Странно. Сейчас. Так. Вот теперь на русском канале. Алло? Да.
Yes.
He's speaking Russian. I
Здесь
chose
он говорит на
English.
русском языке, я выбрал говорить на английском.
That? Silas, can you?
What is that?
Что такое? Что? Как нормально
Someone
идет связь?
is
Нормально идет
speaking
перевод?
over, and I don't. Is it a question?
Если какой-то вопрос?
Андрей,
Если вопрос? Да. Вы
Interpretation,
слышите
but-
меня? Слышите меня? Я не понимаю, в чем была проблема. Я нормально переводил и все хорошо слышал. Что, меня не было, почему-то говорят? Странно.
Андрей, вы сейчас на русском канале? Нет, все слышно сейчас хорошо на русском. Silas, can you hear us? We can continue.
Yeah, I can hear. Was it a question or not?
No, that's fine.
Sorry
Okay,
about that.
good. Okay.
Just keep on.
Okay, so the funding in a nutshell is that utility depends on health status, and then marginal utility is more when an individual is sick. And this makes a lot of sense because then from here, it means that the weight from this side outweighs the other side. So on net, it seems like consumption is a substitute to poor health. And as an estimate, moving from good health state to a poor health state raises marginal utility of consumption by about 2.5 to 4 percentage points, depending on which health measure is used. And this implies that consumption tends to mitigate how poor health affects well-being, which is very important. So if an individual is sick, having higher levels of consumption is good for the person to have improved well-being. So moving on, I used the Russian data set using all the 24 waves available in the second phase from 94 to 2019. And the one good thing about this data set is that attrition is low compared to other panel surveys in high-income countries. And the research shows that it's mainly because there is a low mobility and less frequent changes of address. And this data set is better suited for answering this question because of the fact that it has broad-based measures of consumption, and it also has valid measures of health. So in answering this question, you need measures of utility, measures of consumption, and then other socio-economic and demographic characteristics of the individual. So as a measure of utility, what do I use? So we have a utility proxy, which is evaluative well-being, which is a question in the survey: to what extent are you satisfied with your life in general at the present time? And why do you use this question? Because this evaluative well-being is a powerful predictor of individuals' choices over time. Where to work, for example, who to marry, or where to go depends a lot on individuals' perceived life satisfaction for making these choices. And the assumption here is that in answering this question, the individual pauses and reflects to make an overall judgment of their life. And research shows that this measure is kind of valid and reliable and stable over time. So it's kind of a good proxy for unobserved true utility, which you would think of as a cardinal measure. But here, this is just an ordinal measure, but it's very good. So just to look at this measure, because this is the main outcome variable that I try to explore, you see that the individuals respond to this question in a different way in the early 1990s compared to 2019. And by the way, here I reverse I reverse the order of this evaluative well-being to mean that 1 is like the least score, and then 5 is like fully satisfaction. So with that, you can see that in the early 90s, fewer people were satisfied, or fewer people had high levels of well-being compared to more lately, which is kind of a very interesting kind of phenomenon. And here in answering this question, we try to extract or filter out these time dynamics, which I will talk about in the method I use. And in the baseline, even though I have this range of response, I collapse this response into binary choice. The bottom two is like people who are not satisfied or people who have lower levels of well-being, and 3 to 5 are people who have higher levels of well-being. But later on, I relax this assumption and explore the full range of values. The good thing is when you have a binary choice, then it's easier to interpret and to move around with the estimation. And the next important measure is consumption. So I restrict consumption to non-medical and non-durable household annual consumption extracted from the household level data set. And consumption is grouped into 5 big tickets. The first one is food expenditure, which consists of about 90 different food items. And then it's estimated between the maximum of 7-day average times 52, or the 30-day average expense times 12. And the assumption is that the weekly average is recurrent throughout the year, and then the monthly average is also recurrent throughout the year. And then I have expenditure on fuel, expenditure on tourism, services, and all other expenditures. And here, bear in mind that I exclude non-durables and I also exclude medical expenditure. And the consumption estimates also include consumed on-farm produce at community level prices, which is very important because nearly half the population of Russia consume their own food substances. And the estimates prior to 1998 are also divided by 100 to adjust for the 1998 redenomination of the Russian ruble. And the values are transformed into 2010 prices. And here, in order to capture differences in need by age and economies of scale in consumption within the household, I try to sort of use adult equivalence rather than just using household level per capita, which is very important because you give higher weights to adults in the family and lower weights to children within the family. And then the next measure is how I measure health. And here I use both diagnosed medical conditions. I think about eight measures from cancer to tuberculosis, and then subjective well-being, how subjective health evaluation, how individuals respond to their health without any objective measure. For the sake of time, I wouldn't go into that, but later on, if there is question, I can go deeply into that. So in an overview, this is the descriptive stats. So on average, an individual is observed 12 times, which is kind of good compared to other data of this kind. And there are more women than men. And this is the marital status, about 63%. And then the average age is about 45, which is kind of good for adult life. And then this is the household characteristics. And the income, so I try to compare income and consumption. So here in Russian rubles, in 2010, on average, about 147,000, which is equivalent to about $4,400 for those who are not familiar with the Russian currency. And here, about 3/4 of this value is spent on non-durable and non-medical consumption, which is quite good. So in estimating this question, if you use income, you tend to have a different kind of size and probably sign compared to using actual consumption. And here for health measure, so I use the chronic conditions, which is how many chronic illness an individual has. And on average, in the adult population, an individual has at least one chronic health condition. And then I also use the subjective health, subjective self-assessed health, which ranges between 1 and 5. and the mean is around 2.8. And then the utility proxy also ranges from 1 to 5 with a mean of 3. And then the binary shows that about 64% of the Russian population on average have higher levels of well-being. So here, since the health measure is important, I try to see how these two compare. So here, I look at how diagnosed chronic diseases predict self-assessed health using a non-linear ordered model. And here you see that cancer, for example, and heart disease and stroke predict strongly how individuals assess their health compared to hepatitis, for example, or even tuberculosis. So using these two types of health measures can give a different direction or as to how well I can estimate this dependence of utility on health status. So this is the method I use. I use a fixed effect linear probability model in the baseline. So here, the utility proxy is predicted by the individual's health status. And then I use a CRRA consumption utility function, which is log of consumption. And then here, the interaction term between health and log of consumption. And this is the variable of the coefficient of interest. And if this is positive, it means that poor health, because the way I measure health is that it's increasing in poor health, ranging from 0 and 1. So if it's 1, it means the individual is in extreme poor health. And if it's 0, it means the individual is perfectly healthy. So if this coefficient is positive, it means that poor health really increases, poor health really increases to what extent an individual enjoys consumption. And then here I include both demographic and socioeconomic characteristics of the individual. And I have individual level fixed effects and time fixed effects to extract how the responses correlate with time. And then I have a model to link how this proxy of utility relates with true unobserved utility, which we can discuss later on. So this is the main baseline results. So here, looking at all adults, the age of 16 plus, observed at least 2 times from 94 to 2019. And then looking at the chronic case, which is the objective measures of health, and then this evaluative health measure case. This is what I find. So as expected, poor health really reduces well-being. So poor health in itself reduces well-being by about 27 or 28 percentage points. This is from the average of about 67. So if an individual is completely sick, the level of well-being declines by close to half. And then log of consumption is also positively correlated with well-being as expected. And here, doubling consumption is associated with close to 4 percentage points increase in well-being. And then the variable of interest is the interaction time between health and log of consumption. And here I find it to be positive in both measures of health, and they are kind of similar in size. And here it means that in poor health, consumption is enjoyed better than in sick health. And then I have estimates for other variables. And here I control for a bunch of regional dummies, wave fixed effects, individual level fixed effects, and other coverage as well. So graphically, this is how you can see the response. So plotting everything, holding holding all the other variables that I put in as constant. So I take their means and then see how predicted life satisfaction or predicted well-being moves with different levels of consumption. And here, I think this region is the most important region, from the first percentile to the 99th percentile. And you see that, as I talked about earlier, the slope in poor health states seems to move faster than the slope in good health state, implying that poor health really improves how well-being increases over time. Or in other words, poor health really increases marginal utility of consumption. And this is true for both measures of health. And then I try to look at the nonlinearity, the nonlinearity effect of consumption to see whether consumption is nonlinear, which that's what the theory says. So here I do the same, and then I look at second and third orders of consumption. Individually, it seems there is no strong relationship, but then if you test the joint significance of all the three interaction terms, they are quite significant in both cases, meaning that individually they are not, but then they are jointly significant. And this is depicted quite well in how it shows in graphically. And as I described earlier on, you see that the slope is a lot faster in the poor health state in both measures of health. And then I do a bunch of robustness checks. So I try to use income instead of consumption. And then I use a restricted sample of just non-active workers to see. Sometimes one will argue that consumption really relates with labor income. And then if someone is sick and the person does not have labor income, then the person's consumption level is low. So this might sort of affect what you find. So here I restrict the sample to individuals who do not receive labor income and see how I measure the effect. And it's quite interesting because the sign is the same and the size is quite similar to what I found before. And then I look at different disease intensity. So for example, if I look at chronic, I look at, this is the baseline. I look at different levels of chronic diseases for individuals who have just a single chronic disease, 2 or 3 diseases, or 4 more diseases. And you see that the rate at which disease affects well-being increases with higher levels of, or higher number of chronic diseases. And the interaction term here means that at 2 or more chronic diseases, you tend to have positive effect of poor health on utility. And it's even stronger for people who are really sick with more than 4 or more chronic diseases. And at the same time, I try to separate the sample from those who have just up to 2 chronic diseases and those who have 3 or more chronic diseases. And again, I tend to have a positive relationship, and it's even stronger for people who are sicker. So I do the same for self-assessed health. I have the same results. I look at different consumption subgroups, have for consumption terciles, the results is the same. And I look at the onset of each chronic disease, whether taking each chronic disease, what happens. And it's quite interesting. So I run a single regression and put dummies of chronic diseases and see how the results plays out. And it seems that cancer and hypertension are really the driving force of how these chronic diseases affect its interaction with consumption, affect well-being. But then again, they are jointly significant based on the test I do here. And if I do the non-weighted linear combination of these coefficients and the weighted using the prevalence of each of these chronic disease in the population, and I find significant effects. And the weighted one is a bit lower because the prevalence of cancer is kind of lower in the population compared to the other diseases. And then I look at alternative health measure, which is predicted self-assessed health based on chronic health conditions. As I showed that these two are strongly correlated. So one would think that, well, chronic diseases, there might be bias, or the self-assessed health is subjective, so it's kind of struck with measurement errors. So I do a predicted health based on these two. And again, in the end, the results I find is in line with what I find using the separate measures of health. So that's basically what I do now. And then in other analysis, which I don't show here, I try to move away from the linear model to a non-linear model. So first I look at the binary model and use bias corrected probit and logit, because normally when you do fixed effects and you just run probit or logit, you have bias results. But then there have been ways of correcting for this bias. I use that approach, and the results I find is in line with what I find. And then I use the full length of the range of well-being from 1 to 5 and use ordered nonlinear models, which is a bit more complicated, but again, the conclusion is the same. So then it makes sense to show the much simpler results, which is easier to interpret. But these results are available in the paper, and it will be good for reading if you are interested. So in a nutshell, in concluding, using valid measures of health and broad-based consumption expenditure, we are able to determine that the utility function of the individual depends heavily on the individual's health status. And we find that utility is highest in poor health state compared to good health state. And I think here I have a limitation because the ordinal utility measure is just ordinal compared to having like cardinal measures. So the magnitude I find, like 2.5 to 4% increase in marginal utility, is not really clear what that means. And right now what I'm trying to do is how to sort of translate this magnitude into consumption equivalent terms, which is what I'm working on right now. And this results sort of leads to some policy implications in the sense that given that utility is highest in poor health states, then it's optimal to increase savings towards the end of the life cycle, because that's when health really deteriorates. And it's also optimal to transfer more resources to agents who are negatively affected by poor health, and in particular in this current COVID situation. And then there is also important to also sort of seek for interstate resource transfers, in the sense that transferring resources from healthy state to poorer state, so that utility, the resources will be enjoyed in the state where utility is highest. So that brings me to the end of this presentation. Thanks for your attention. And if there is any question, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Silas, for a very detailed presentation. Questions, comments? I see we have here experts on health and experts on consumption, so you might have some questions or comments. Yeah, so I see Judith, hello. Please, yeah.
Yeah, I'm here. You did thank you very much for the presentation. You did quite a thorough job. So my question really is, how can you have these policy implications already when we've seen the heterogeneity, for example, which you do show between men and women, between different groups. So it seems to me that your policy implications are independent of these other findings, and it worries me. And
So when the thing is, there is not much heterogeneity in the findings. So for example, I don't show the results here, but then the finding is the same for men and women, for example.
Well, then I am curious about it, and I would suggest there's no one presenting today, but that it would be a good idea to talk to people who have published recently and have different findings from the RLMS to find out why your results are different from theirs. We know how easily, unfortunately, just changing the years and the way you do it can affect these outcomes. And it would be good to compare your findings, which are very important. There's a very good paper, I thought, which shows the impact. It's called How Self-Assessed is Self-Assessed Health. And to compare yours with theirs might be a good idea. I find it slightly implausible, given what we know about everything else, that self-assessed health is going to be independent of gender. But you might be correct. It's very important to bring your findings to that. I think it's more important than your policy implications, what you have found in your detailed study.
Yeah, that's well noted. Thanks a lot. So I agree that there might be some heterogeneity in self-assessed health based on gender. So that is true. But then here, how this heterogeneity relates to individuals' perceived utility, that's kind of a different question. And I think it's good to know that the results is the same for men and women, even though both men and women have different trajectories of health. In the end, when they are both in poor health, their utility levels are higher, which I think is plausible. No?
Well, I have difficulty in thinking about the marginal utility question and redistribution, particularly because you have indicated, if I'm correct, that this is not a large effect size. And so you have not considered at all any of the costs of redistribution, which concern me. But I'm more interested in trying to find out more about what we do, your new measures of predicted health and so on. I'll give you my bias, which is not necessarily shared by most people, but I myself spent 18 months working on the European Community Household Panel on this. And between countries, you had enormous differences. You still do, in what self-assessed health means. That's another thing apart from gender. And Russia is large enough that I am interested in differences in regions, and that's why your study seems extremely valuable, but you have to dig down and look at the identification strategy as well, which concerns me. But anyway, my bias is that when it says, oh, it's a good predictor and it's a wonderful metric, that in fact, that's true in the work ages, but not in the older population. And that's another thing that might be a good thing to do, is to break it. You have only active workers, but you might actually break it at age instead of active and inactive workers, perhaps, because the inactive workers will include the disability level, right?
Okay,
so
that's noted. Thanks a lot.
But there, you said it was work in progress. I wouldn't have jumped up and said this, I admit, if it was finished. But I think it's really, I think your work is more valuable in what it indicates about understanding how we measure these things, given how expensive it is in a survey to go out there and actually have things like gait speed and grip strength. And so we ask people, and we need to understand what it is we're asking them. And all over the world, we don't quite. So that's where I think it's really valuable.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Judith, and thank you for, thank you. I'll ask, there is one more question. Anastasia Lysina has a question, so please.
Yes, I had a remark. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Silas, for your presentation. So I was also, let's say, I wanted to say that it is also important to talk about how relevant are the subjective and self-assessed measures, and your presentation reminded me of the discussion on this Leiden school subjective measures of well-being, because I also work with subjective measures, and I'm constantly getting, you know, those remarks whether how well are these, how well measured are these measures, and if someone scores 5, is it the same as if another person in Siberia scores 5? So we don't really know this, and it is important to talk about this and discuss. And yeah, I think there is also not really an answer to this question, but yeah, just would like to stress this, and maybe you would like to also read a little bit more on the Leiden school. They talk a lot about these measures and whether how well defined they are. And another thing that I wanted to bring is I don't know if you adjust for differences in prices across the regions. I don't think this would affect your results a lot, but it's still important to adjust for the differences in prices, because 100 rubles do not buy the same amount of goods in Siberia compared to Moscow. So yeah, I think it's also important. But thank you very much for your presentation.
You're welcome. So thanks a lot. So one thing about the subjective well-being, the subjective responses is that, so here, especially if you regress subjective variable on a subjective outcome, then you have a lot of problems. That's why in the analysis, I try to focus more on the objective health measures, which is mainly how many diagnosed chronic diseases an individual has. And the disease only enters in the health measure only when it's diagnosed by a doctor. Again, I mean, that also has a lot of limitations. Someone might have a cancer, but if it's not diagnosed, you don't detect. So there are a lot of sort of challenges as to how well you can measure these. And as you rightly said, but again, I think given the data set, this is what we can do so far, but at least it's important to dig deeper and see how valid or how credible or reliable these results are. And again, on the utility side, the subjective well-being side, there have been a lot of literature on this and how well it's being measured. And I think recently the WHO has a very detailed data set measuring really like these well-being measures using the subjective well-being, or actually going into deeply emotional flows within a day, which is and that data set includes Russia. So what I'm currently doing is comparing these estimates with the detailed estimates from that data set collected by the WHO. But in the literature, the subjective well-being measures have been proven to be quite valid, especially the life satisfaction one, and it's stable over time. So think of it that if you ask someone, how satisfied are you with your life given your circumstances? If you ask the person today, the person is more likely to respond the same if you ask the person 2 weeks or 1 month's time. So it's quite stable because the individual sort of reflects and really think about it. So, I mean, there's not time to look at the empirical strategy as Judith mentioned, but there is a way to relate this subjective well-being with true cardinal well-being, which will not only just be between 1 and 5, but actually treated it as cardinal. And as you said, if someone responds 5 in Russia, doesn't mean the same for someone responding 5 in Europe. But the point is here, given that we are in one country, and even within Russia, someone responding in Moscow might be different from someone responding in St. Petersburg, for example. But I mean, I try my best by sort of controlling for regional, diversity, and also individual unobserved heterogeneity. So the expectation is that these treatment will sort of take out the bias you would expect, but at least there is still room for improvement, and I'm still working on it and getting more feedback to improve the paper. So thanks a lot.
Silas, thank you very much. Probably we have time for very short question and very short answer. If there are no such, then we have to close our session because we run out of time. I just want to thank once again Darya and Silas for your presentation and wish you success in your further work. All the best. Thank you very much for participating in this session.